think we can get started. Welcome everyone on behalf of the Lexington Historical Society. My name is Sarah McDonough. I'm the programs manager here, and I'm joined by our own director, Carol Ward, and Amanda Lang of Historic Deerfield. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of how this Zoom webinar is going to work, we would like to have a few words from Carol to introduce us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Well, thank you to everyone out there in Zoom world for joining us this afternoon. I am so excited to have Amanda with us. We were just chatting a little bit before we went live that Amanda and I have known each other for many, many years, since I did a chocolate celebration at the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut. So we won't talk about how many years ago that was. You know, chocolate is very near and dear to my heart as people are learning. It's a family business, and I love sharing the knowledge of contemporary chocolate and, of course, historical chocolate with every place that I go. And thank you to those, because I see that there's some repeat visitors to Chocolate Land from last week at our talk at the new Archives and Research Center here at Lexington Historical Society. So Amanda has been so generous with her time. She's gonna do a little bit of like a tag team to my talk last week. And Amanda is the Curatorial Department Director and Curator of Historic Interiors at Historic Deerfield. And we were just saying that I'm gonna need to make a visit sooner rather than later. So before Amanda starts, Sarah's going to give us a little nuts and bolts on how we work our Zoom, and then we will start our lecture.
Great. So for anyone who hasn't been on a Zoom in a while, this is a webinar, which means that we can see that you are here, but you will not be able to see each other. There are several ways to communicate, however. If you hover your mouse around the bottom of your screen, or sometimes if you're using an iPad or a mobile device, it might be at the top of your screen. You'll see a number of different ways to interact with each other and with us. If you have any discussion that you'd like to have during the talk, we would ask that go in the chat window on the side of your screen. And if you have any questions for Amanda herself, there's also a button on the bottom of the screen for Q&A. And that'll just make sure that all of your questions go to one place so that I can find them. Feel free to start the conversation or start asking questions at any point during the presentation, but we'll have some dedicated time specifically for some back and forth with Amanda at the end of the discussion. And as for all of our chocolate programming, we would also like to thank the very generous sponsorship of the Beth Sager Group and also Mass Cultural Council.
Super.
Right, so I'm going to spotlight you, Amanda, and whenever you're ready, you can start.
Great. Let's see.
If you need me to pull up any slides, just let me know.
I thought it would be pulled up. Just hold on just 1 second. Let's see. Is this appearing on your screen the way it is like mine? Or maybe I need to share my slide again.
Yep, we're seeing you, Amanda.
Just seeing me. Okay. Let me exit out of this. But I think maybe once I get out of this, it should be okay.
As Amanda's looking for her presentation, I'll do a little plug. So our next chocolate event is coming up this upcoming Thursday. It's going to be an in-person event with Spindler Confections out of Cambridge, and we can send you some more information on that if anyone's interested. We'll put it in the chat later.
So it looks like I'm screen sharing now, which is a good thing.
You are all good, Amanda.
That's excellent. So thank you very much, Carol, for inviting me to come to the Lexington Historical Society. I'm so pleased to join you today, and I'm really happy to talk about kind of one of my favorite lecture topics, which is about the history of chocolate. It's really one of those topics that everyone can, even if they're not interested in history, everybody's interested in food. And that's a really one of those wonderful things about food history is that, you know, if you love food, you'll be interested in food history too. So I think it's going to be a fun topic for us to explore today. So this afternoon, we're going to be learning yet again about the history of chocolate, focusing more on the European and New England experience with chocolate. And I'm going to be talking about chocolate as an early medicine, chocolate as a breakfast beverage, chocolate as sort of portable energy for the military, as well as the equipment that was used to prepare and serve the beverage in places like New England. So as you all know, I think you probably had a very thorough examination of the cacao tree the last time you met. But the Latin name for the chocolate tree is Theobroma cacao, and it literally means food of the gods. And anyone who's tasted chocolate knows why this name is so appropriate. And chocolate, even though, you know, we experience it today mostly as like, you know, Mars, you know, kisses or other kinds of, you know, Dove bars and other types of things, for most of its history, chocolate was a drink. And it's only been a confectionery treat for maybe the last 100 years or so. So like potatoes and corn, chocolate is a New World food. While the exact origins of the cacao tree are kind of still being debated, the plant probably originated in the tropical rainforests of the Orinoco and Amazon River basins of South America, maybe over 4,000 years ago. Early Mesoamerican societies first domesticated cacao trees between 1900 and 1500 BCE. And that was in the area of southern Chiapas and Veracruz, Mexico. So if you know where the Yucatan Peninsula is, that sort of is the place where cacao was cultivated, where it was farmed and produced specifically for making of chocolate beverages for the most part. The drink was predominantly used by the Mayan and the Aztec cultures, and I think you've heard a little bit about that the previous week. But we'll pick up our story where Europeans come in. And in the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors were searching the New World for gold and silver, new sources of wealth, as well as for converts to Christianity. And someone named Girolamo Benzoni was probably one of the first Europeans who tasted the Aztec beverage, which they call cacahuatl. And he wrote that he found it somewhat bitter, noting that it satisfies and refreshes the body, but it doesn't inebriate. So the first documented appearance that we have of chocolate in Europe, actually it occurs in Spain, occurs in 1544, when a group of Dominican friars brought a delegation of Mayan nobles to meet Prince Philip. And among these gifts that the nobles presented to the prince were receptacles of beaten chocolate. And just to review, Prince Philip did eventually become King of Spain, but he also became King of England. This is the man who married Queen Mary, who reigned in England for a very brief period of time, but she married the King of Spain, and that was he didn't spend a tremendous amount of time in England, but they ruled as sort of joint monarchs at that time. So it was used in Spain among the court elite as an expensive beverage, but as a healthy drink. It was thought to have promoting all sorts of kind of healthy benefits for the humors in your body in terms of keeping it in balance, because that's what wellness was, is the balance of the four humors in your body, which usually are blood and phlegm and black bile and yellow bile, just to be specific on that. It was also thought to be a quick energy drink, and also for Catholic countries, a suitable libation a suitable drink for religious fast days where you weren't supposed to eat food, but you could drink beverages. And chocolate was perhaps maybe the easiest way to get through a religious fast because it has so much in the way of fat and calories to help you maintain that your energy level during a fast day. So Spanish nobles, they kept the use of chocolate for themselves as a beverage, but eventually it was brought to other European nations, often by marriage between European aristocratic families. Theobroma cacao, or simply cacao, is the plant that produces chocolate. And I won't dwell on this a lot because you probably know very much about it, but cacao is a rainforest tree that can only grow 20 degrees north or south of the equator. So it very much loves that kind of tropical heat. Pods unusually form on the trunk and on the larger branches of the tree. And you have these large pods, which when you split them open, contain about 30 to 40 almond-shaped seeds, surrounded by a very sweet, juicy pulp. After you ferment, as you can see, it's fermented on banana leaves. You start to develop chocolate flavor. Eventually, once fermentation stops after a few days, you start to dry out those cocoa nibs or kernels of cacao. And at this stage, once they're dry, they're ready to be roasted. Of course, roasting can happen in the origins, but also it can happen far, far away. You can roast almost anywhere, but of course you can't grow chocolate anywhere. The roasted cacao is those beans, after they're kind of roasted, usually over a charcoal fire, are eventually cracked open, cracked in a mortar. And there's the mortar at Colonial Williamsburg. And the outer shell of the cacao nib is, that thin shell is broken away. You can either peel it off by hand or you can actually winnow it. And there's the Jim Gay, formerly of Colonial Williamsburg, with a winnowing basket where he would, throw up the cacao nibs up into the air, and those chocolate shells, being lighter, are going to be taken off by the wind. Having seen this in action, those winnowing baskets actually work pretty poorly, and the best way to do it is actually to kind of take off the chocolate shells with your hands. It's one of those things where sort of recreating. Who knows? Maybe we're not doing it right, but recreating past efforts really just didn't pan out. So the next thing you would do is you're going to grind this sort of naturally gritty cacao. And it requires strength and endurance and also patience, since the process really took a few hours to do. And what you want to get is, the smaller the particle size, the more chocolate flavor is going to be released. And also, the smaller the particle size, the smoother the sensation on your tongue. Today, modern chocolate is so smooth. It goes through a machine called a conching machine, which is just basically rolls it between rollers in order to get it very, very thin to give you that smooth sensation. Chocolate that we're going to be talking about would probably only be able to get to a certain size, not very small, because you just didn't have the technology to do that. It's probably ground as small as you could grind wheat or corn on a milling machine. So it's small, but it's not as small as it eventually gets. Once you do this, once you start grinding on one of these stone rollers, called a chocolate stone and roller, in Spanish that's called a metate y mano, meaning it's a chocolate surface, and metate means hand. So it's a heated stone roller, and the kind of the roller that you're using, the rolling pin, is sort of named after the name for hand. So what you're doing is you're crushing these cacao nibs, but it also, as I said, they contain so much fat. They're about 50% cocoa butter. Once you start, it's like peanuts. Once you start expressing the fat out of the cacao nibs, it starts to get very much like honey. It starts to get very tacky. And what helps express that fat out of the cacao nibs, and you can see it in both of these images here, is that you have a box of charcoal underneath. And heat helps the process go along quite quickly, or quicker. You can also see this is another view of a painting of a man grinding cacao on a metate y mano in Spain. And you can also see the nibs are in a bowl beside him. He's got balls of chocolate, produced chocolate, that are right in front of him, sort of cooling on paper. So once you scrape that taffy, honey-like substance, more honey than taffy, but that very kind of viscous substance off the metate y mano, off of the chocolate stone and roller, you're going to gather it up and probably make it into a ball or press it into a form in order to make a cake. Within a century of its arrival in Spain, both the culinary and medicinal uses of chocolate had spread to both France and England. By 1657, you have an entrepreneur in London's Public Advertiser announcing chocolate sale there, selling an excellent West India drink called chocolate to be sold where you may have it ready at any time, and also unmade at reasonable rates. So basically he's saying, I can make it for you and serve it to you here, or you can take the raw materials and make it at home. So throughout the 17th century, chocolate was still relatively new in England and considered an expensive luxury. Underscoring that are the chocolate kitchens that were built at Hampton Court Palace. These were built by Christopher Wren about 1690 as part of William III's and Queen Mary's II's renovations of Hampton Court. Its inclusion in a new part of the palace demonstrated wealth and power and the modernity of William and Mary's court, because they were incorporating this new fashionable beverage into their court life. The king and queen would usually take chocolate as a drink at breakfast time, and it was often served in their bedchamber and part of the ritual, the sort of royal ritual known as the levee, which is where the king or queen would get dressed ceremoniously in front of a special chosen few, in front of those special courtiers. William, however, was also very fond of chocolate, and he would drink chocolate throughout the day. George I, who eventually, not immediately, but eventually succeeded William and Mary in 1714, also lived at Hampton Court in the early 18th century, and he loved chocolate too, to such an extent that he hired his own chocolate maker, a man named Thomas Tossier. So you can see an image here from Hampton Court. They also found an inventory of the contents of the chocolate kitchen that was in Hampton Court, and it formed the basis of a 2014 reinstallation of the chocolate kitchens there. And when we can all kind of travel a little bit more freely, I definitely have that on my list of things. If I go back to England, that's definitely a place that I want to go visit and talk to the interpreters who discuss chocolate in England in the late 17th and early 18th century. So along with coffee and tea, chocolate was a very popular beverage in London coffee houses. But of course not as popular as coffee was there. This new beverage was flavorful, it was rich, it was nutritious, and chocolate was a real boon to the 17th and 18th century diet. Although chocolate does contain some stimulation in the form of theobromine and a small amount of caffeine, it has more caloric than stimulating value. Early supporters of tea, coffee, and chocolate really promoted the fact that these beverages were sobering, that they weren't intoxicating like the other alcoholic alternatives. For most people before 1650, starting their day would have been a glass of wine if you're kind of wealthy, or maybe a glass of beer or ale. And in New England, probably hard cider. That would have been your morning beverage of choice. And these were definitely good alternatives to that. So you weren't, addled by 10:30. So given the additional kind of custom duties that they placed on chocolate in England, and they were taxed, at least in 1660, they were taxed at 8 pence per gallon of chocolate. So it sounds like they were taxing prepared chocolate. It really remained an expensive luxury in Europe, and often associated with wealth, with leisure time, and also with sort of languor or relaxation. I'm showing you this image, which was painted by William Hogarth. This is a scene from one painting as part of a series called Mariage à la Mode, which is definitely a very dark view of marriage in 18th century England. It kind of traces the history of a marriage between a wealthy merchant's daughter and an aristocrat's son, and it just unfortunately leads to both of their destruction. But this is a scene where I believe that his father has died and he's inherited a bit of wealth, and his wife is enjoying it. So she is Countess Squanderfield, and she is enjoying her toilette, or basically she's getting ready in the morning, and she is entertaining her lover, who is the lawyer who is kind of spread out beside her on the couch. And her lawyer is Mr. Silvertongue. So she is at her dressing table. She is getting her hair done by her hairdresser, and some of her guests are as well. You can see one of her guests is drinking chocolate and has curlers in his hair, and one of her servants is bringing in chocolate on a salver. So, and quite a few other of her friends or hangers-on or retinue are drinking chocolate at her sort of morning levee, or her morning dressing table. So that gives you a little bit closer view of the bringing of a cup of chocolate. And we'll talk about how do you know that's a cup of chocolate? Short answer is it is a taller, larger capacity cup, and a different shape than I would expect to see for a teacup. So I'm guessing, it's a good guess that it's probably chocolate, and it's in the morning. So that also makes it pretty appropriate they're serving chocolate. So chocolate has a long history in New England too. Given our close economic connections to the West Indies, New England merchants supplied barrel staves and lumber and salt fish and salt beef and horses to the Caribbean in exchange for sugar, molasses, rum, and also cacao. Boston silversmith and mintmaster John Hull, in his diary for 1667 to 1668, he recorded the loss of his ship called the Providence, which was carrying, as he called it, cocoa. The rising demand for chocolate led to the development of cacao plantations and the export businesses in Spain's colonies of Venezuela, also in Mexico, specifically in Soconusco, and in Guatemala. France's West Indian islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique also produced cacao, and in French Guiana, they produce cacao. The Dutch island of Curacao and the colony of Suriname produce cacao, as well as England's island of Jamaica and the St. Thomas possessions. Although the cultivation of cacao was attempted by many countries, really smuggling Spanish cacao was a vital link in the supply chain and the main source for the American colonial market. So most of what you see coming into, the American market, the New England market as well, is Spanish cacao. And you do see it listed under names like Maracaibo or Caracas, and and Soconosco and those types of, it is readily identifiable as Spanish cacao. So it was kind of vital. This Spanish cacao was vital to the American colonies, but also due to its lower transportation costs, chocolate was often less expensive in the Americas than it was in Europe. And therefore, it actually had a broader consumer base, not as much as the exclusive luxury beverage for just a few. To a lesser degree than sugar manufacturing, chocolate plantations did require a consistent source of labor, which did lead as well to the forcible transportation and enslavement of West Africans for cacao cultivation. The other thing that also helped kind of spur the production of or spur the slave trade as it relates to all those hot beverages of tea, coffee, and chocolate was that they are all sugar delivery vehicles. That the rise in these beverages, the fact that everyone really enjoyed them and enjoyed them a lot for a variety of different reasons, really encouraged the demand for West Indian sugar to sweeten these beverages. So there is a strong link between slavery and chocolate, as well as coffee and tea too. Well, along with Philadelphia, New York, and Newport, Boston was a major importer of cacao and also a major producer of ground chocolate. Cacao, which was commonly called coconuts, arrived in Boston by the hogshead, the barrel, or the bag. Boston had about 24 chocolate grinders who worked in the 18th century. And early in the century, grinders were primarily located in the north end of Boston, then spreading out to the south end and into Charlestown and Watertown and Dorchester. Chocolate grinders offered their product for sale, and then they also provided roasting and milling services for other people. The chocolate mills free and enslaved laborers roasted cacao beans over charcoal. They cracked the beans in mortar, and they removed those outer shells, and they ground the nibs, either using horsepower or water power. Chocolate makers, who could more accurately be called millers, shaped the oily chocolate paste into cakes and balls or lozenges that weighed about 2 to 4 ounces apiece. And I'll just show you, there is evidence of enslaved labor being used in the chocolate grinding industry in Boston. So this is a self-emancipating person running away from his place of work, running away from his enslaver, James Lubbock of Boston. So in the 18th century in Boston, Judge Samuel Sewall mentions chocolate many times in his famous diary and often presented it as a gift. His use of chocolate for presentation purposes suggests its high social status and cultured good taste at that time. Judge Samuel Sewall noted these chocolate offerings several times, and on March 31st in 1707, he visited Mr. Gibbs and presented him with a pound of chocolate and 3 of Cousin Moody's sermons. And one wonders whether the sermons were received as well as the chocolate. When chocolate was first introduced into England as well as into colonial North America in the late 17th century, it was often used as an exotic medicine and to nourish the sick, to aid digestion, to cure lung ailments, to relieve depression, to energize the body, which it definitely did, to cure hangovers, to suppress coughs, and to promote longevity. You can almost think of the way that they used chocolate in that time was similar to the nutritional drinks of Booster and Sure, that it's a high caloric drink. You don't need teeth to chew it. It's something that you could drink and maintain your health by getting enough calories to continue going on, or to get over your health ailment where you're temporarily sick and you're recovering from an illness. Its perceived medicinal value also made chocolate a natural product for sale in apothecary shops. So chocolate also, as many of you probably know, had a reputation as well as an aphrodisiac, and that certainly helped its burgeoning popularity. It was thought by doctors at the time that chocolate encouraged venery, which means sexual indulgence in women. And some doctors reported that chocolate even caused conception in women. So chocolate's reputation for being an aphrodisiac really goes back to some of the original stories of Emperor Montezuma, who was said to or reported to have drunk several cups of chocolate for fortification before visiting his wives. As far as we know today, chocolate contains two chemicals that are sort of linked to arousal. One is tryptophan, one of the building blocks of serotonin, and also phenylethylamine, which is a stimulant related to amphetamines, which is released in the brain when people fall in love. Well, drinking chocolate in New England was both a public and a private custom. Chocolate was taken at coffee houses, as evidenced by this newspaper advertisement by Mary Ballard. It was also taken at taverns, such as this one in Deerfield. We know that Lucy Terry went to the local merchant and bought basically almost a pound of chocolate for serving at Ebenezer Wells's tavern that he actually ran out of his house. Chocolate was drunk at home, particularly in the morning for breakfast. And a French officer stationed in Rhode Island during the Revolutionary War described the American use of chocolate in this way. And it really takes a foreigner to kind of come to your country and describe what you're doing. It sort of kind of cuts through any kind of bias that you might have, because the foreigner is really saying, hey, this is really different. So he's saying in the morning they breakfast on coffee, chocolate, and slices of toast with butter. They serve cheese, jam, pickles, and sometimes fried meat. It should be remarked that those least well off always drink coffee or tea in the morning, and I would believe sell their last shirt to procure it. Chocolate could also be drunk at different times of the day, so it didn't always have to be taken at breakfast. For example, Madame Sarah Kemble Knight arrived in the evening in a clean, comfortable inn in the Narragansett country when she was traveling during her famous trip from Boston to New Haven in October of 1704. The owner of the home or inn asked what Madame Knight might want to eat, and she replied, I told her I had some chocolate. If she would prepare it, which with the help of some milk and a little clean brass kettle, she soon effected to my satisfaction. The other really important use of chocolate in early America was being used by the military. Soldiers supplemented sometimes their meager rations with chocolate in order to provide quick and portable energy. Benjamin Franklin secured 6 pounds of chocolate per officer as a special supply for those soldiers marching with General Braddock's army at the onset of the French and Indian War. As well as during the American Revolution, commissaries accounted for a steady supply of chocolate at such northern defenses as Fort Ticonderoga, where Captain Moses Greenleaf of Newburyport, Massachusetts, regularly in his diary breakfasted on chocolate. Sutlers, and they were people who followed an army and sold provisions. A sutler's account book documents purchases of soldiers in Captain Edward Blake's company, of Colonel Joseph Ingersoll's Massachusetts Provincial Regiment. And this account book, which was kept at Crown Point between November of 1762 to June of 1763. And it itemizes the sale of goods to soldiers and officers. And over half of the entries, interesting to note, are for chocolate. All in all, this account book sold nearly 73 pounds of chocolate to 32 soldiers at Crown Point during the winter of 1762 to 1763. And it seems that chocolate was most popular during the winter months, suggesting that chocolate was nourishing and invigorating for the body as well as warming. Chocolate was often listed as being sold by the cake, and this is a rare illustration of chocolate in cake form, as it appears in an advertisement for a Philadelphia mustard and chocolate maker. Who would expect those two things to go together? It's in a newspaper of about 1758 in the Pennsylvania Gazette. It illustrates a rectangular block of chocolate with molded seams that looks very similar to a modern commercially produced chocolate bar. And the seams, just like today, are intended to facilitate easy breakage of that cake or tablet into smaller, more manageable bars. Chocolate was also a major part of the food supplies at military hospitals. It was, yet again, a well-known energy food because of 50% of that being cocoa butter, pure fat, and it was readily digestible. Even men recovering from smallpox or fever were given chocolate, and sometimes chocolate. It was interesting to read this, that sometimes chocolate was misused by soldiers. General Philip Schuyler lamented that the men from Connecticut who seemed to be ill and were discharged and sent home as unfit for service. Schuyler was saying, he hinted to Connecticut Governor John Trumbull that some of these men had scorched their tongues with hot chocolate in order to induce a belief that they actually had a fever. So naughty on their part. Well, pound for pound, chocolate was far less expensive than tea, but more expensive than coffee. And this is an account book reference from Deerfield. And it shows you of Major Elijah Williams going to Boston, and he's buying, lucky for us, 40 pounds of coffee, 40 pounds of chocolate, and 40 pounds of tea. And what you see next to them is the at symbol. And what it's telling you is what it costs per pound. So coffee cost 8 shillings per pound, chocolate 10 shillings per pound, and tea a whopping 37 shillings and 6 pence per pound. Just a huge amount of money, almost 4 times as much as chocolate. But so really, it's coffee was the cheapest and also probably gave you the most bang for your buck. American coffee, when these foreign visitors came, they thought American coffee was horrible and was incredibly weak. The one thing about serving chocolate is you really can't serve, or they didn't or wouldn't serve, a weak cup of chocolate. I guess you could, but it took a lot of the material to make a good cup of chocolate. So there might not be a tremendous amount of savings, even though it was, slightly more expensive. You had to use more of it to make a good cup of chocolate. So period recipes, when you look at recipes, can add a variety of different ingredients to it, spices, and eggs, and more sugar, and rose waters for different kind of fragrances. But at its simplest, which is the way most people took it almost, every day if they had it for breakfast, it was grated chocolate that you bought from the local merchant, mixed with sugar, maybe a little more sugar, and either wine or milk or water. Adding to chocolate's complexity, of course, is the high fat content. Over 50% of one of those chocolate round balls would be cocoa butter. So it's very nourishing because fat gives you energy, but also fat content was one of its detracting characteristics. So sometimes they added starches. You might add flour, or maybe you might add toast or bread into your chocolate drink in order to absorb that excess fat, or sometimes you even skimmed off the fat before you served it. Given that fat content, you also needed to stir it vigorously. And what people commonly used was a chocolate mill. In different languages, these were called molinet in French, molinillo in Spanish. In English, they were called chocolate mills. And they're typically made out of wood, measuring about 10 to 12 inches in length. And they have these notched ends to them. And when you whirl them between your hands, it would produce a uniform consistency in the liquid, and it would also raise a desired froth. And I think today you could consider our addition of, we do it almost automatically, whipped cream, marshmallows, or whatever. We do that kind of without thinking where might that have come from, other than just being very yummy. It's probably a culinary sort of holdover or vestige of this older tradition of very frothed chocolate. Although chocolate could be made in a simple pot or cup over a brazier, proper and elegant preparation of chocolate required a chocolate pot. And a chocolate pot's most distinctive feature was an aperture or hole in the lid that allowed for the insertion of that essential stirring rod. A removable cap or finial or a small hole with a swinging or hinged cover formed the necessary opening. French silversmiths are credited with the invention of the chocolate pot in the late 17th century, the first one being dated 1671. But the English silversmiths were right on their heels, quickly imitating those French silver examples and producing some as early as 1685. Silver chocolate pots are very rare forms in American silver, especially 18th century American silver, with only 8 known Boston examples. The Museum of Fine Arts Boston has a very large quantity of them. And this is one example that was made by John Coney, which has that finial that pops off, displaying a hole in the center for the insertion of the stirring rod. It's kind of hard to imagine that might pop off, but it does indeed. My institution, Historic Deerfield, out in Western Massachusetts, out in Deerfield, we are lucky enough that our founders acquired a huge collection of silver during their lifetime, and they purchased a chocolate pot, a later example from about 1760 or so, made by Zachariah Brigden of Boston. And you won't believe me, but I can tell you that finial, that top thing on top of the cover, does pull out, and you can insert a rod in the center of it so you can froth up the chocolate. I'm sure it could have done double duty. It looks almost identical to a coffee pot, so they probably could have gotten both beverages out of this one single pot. These silver chocolate pots were extraordinarily stylish and costly, and American silversmiths didn't hesitate to create silver chocolate pots for those elite patrons who desired them. But the majority of Americans and people in New England prepared their morning draft of chocolate in a more humble material, such as copper, brass, maybe tin sheet iron or tinware. And they appear far more frequently than silver versions. And someone today could create a collection of copper chocolate pots if they wanted to. They're still available and out on the antiques market. It's not too hard to find them. Ceramic chocolate pots, of course, are much more rarely encountered. That would be a very, very difficult thing to put together a collection of ceramic chocolate pots. Perhaps it's the vigorous frothing that might have led to breakage over time and ultimately just discarding the parts. Historic Deerfield is also, since we were very interested in the history of chocolate, we also acquired a couple of examples of ceramic chocolate pots. And this one has all 3 of its pieces, not only the pot and the collar, but also the finial. Several historical references do talk about skillets being used to make chocolate. And I suspect they did kind of dispense with any pretense of frothing the beverage, unless you sort of used a whisk or something in a skillet. One very interesting reference to using a skillet is revealed in an article in the Boston Gazette of 1735. And, excuse me, and that Boston Gazette talks about a man named Humphrey Scarlett and his wife and two children of Boston. And they accused two enslaved men in their household, a man named Yaw and a boy named Caesar, of poisoning them, saying that arsenic or ratsbane had been placed in their skillet of chocolate, which they eat for breakfast. That hot chocolate was usually poured into a ceramic cup for drinking, and identifying a specific vessel for drinking chocolate is slightly more difficult, since new fashions for drinking the beverage continually evolved over time, and also much depended on your budget, your social status, and your inclination. At first, chocolate in England was so precious that sometimes it was served from gold vessels. And even though these look huge, they're very small. So they're not very large. I think probably 11.2 centimeters. I'd probably get out my desk chair. Maybe that's probably about 2 inches. I think that's not more than 2 inches. Maybe it's probably about maybe 3.5 inches tall. It's not very big, but these are very, very precious gold vessels, which are used in the late 17th century for the serving of chocolate in England. Eventually, they get served in other, conductive metals are not the greatest for hot chocolate. Eventually, they get served in other types of vessels, mostly ceramic vessels. And chocolate was typically served in tall, handled, or handle-less ceramic beakers, usually with a flaring lip. Sometimes those beakers had covers, but often they didn't. And the beverage came with this frothy head to it. And that may explain why the beverages, or why these ceramic cups were taller. It's almost like the concept of a champagne glass, that maybe these taller vessels would extend the life of the froth. Chocolate also tended to be served in larger capacity vessels than something like coffee, since you would drink more of the beverage at one sitting than you would of tea or coffee. So what you see is the chocolate cup in the center. This is a whole set or service that gives you coffee, chocolate, and tea wares. The tea bowl is on your right-hand side, and that's the shallow bowl for the service of tea. Coffee is on the far left-hand side. That gives you the U-shaped vessel, but it's not hugely large. But in the center, it's a U-shaped vessel. These are likely with handles for the serving of chocolate. And probably the saucers are used almost interchangeably in this set. So there's clear evidence in New England, in the American colonies, that American colonists, as well as British, used coffee cups, chocolate cups, as well as teacups. So they were being sold here in Boston. But probably they were far less rigid when serving chocolate. Maybe they were likely using a variety of different vessels to get the job done. Almost 100% they were using teacups in order to serve chocolate as well. That's not a far stretch of the imagination. And from print sources in Britain, we know they were also using mugs, because what you see in the background with the servant, she's bringing in on a tray or a waiter a chocolate pot, because it has the stirring rod sticking right at the top of it, and also not bringing chocolate cups or teacups or coffee cups. She's bringing mugs, probably Delftware, so type of ceramic Delftware mugs, in order to bring the breakfast beverage to the people who employ her, who are receiving a visit from the jeweler. Always a good thing to receive in the morning is the visit from the jeweler. So going back to that case that we were talking about with Humphrey Scarlett, and the attempted murder charge of Humphrey Scarlett and his family by poisoning their chocolate. There actually, in the testimony, there was another enslaved woman in the house named Betty, and she also fell ill when she licked her master's porringer after he had been to breakfast. And porringer, so But before starting a study of chocolate, I never would have thought porringers were for it had anything to do with drinking chocolate, but they actually served for drinking chocolate, both silver as well as ceramic. And these were multi-purpose vessels with a small bowl, usually with a tab handle on the end of it, so you can hold it. And probably a non-conductive ceramic porringer would have been ideal for the serving of your breakfast beverage of hot chocolate. Porringers quickly went out of style in England, but Americans really retained this useful form for the service of soups and stews, as well as chocolate. So Thomas Jefferson said that the superiority of chocolate for both health and nourishment will soon give it preference over tea and coffee in America, which it has in Spain. Well, I think we know that Jefferson's prediction never came true, at least in terms of chocolate being the preferred beverage for Americans. We know that ultimately coffee won the day. But perhaps his prediction was fully realized in the terms of chocolate becoming America's favorite confection. Well, moving on with our chocolate history, in the first half of the 19th century, American consumers bypassed chocolate in favor of cheaper teas and coffee for their morning beverage. Chocolate was often relegated as a beverage for children or as a nutritional supplement for the infirm. It still had held on to that strong connection with sickness, with healing, and giving chocolate to people who had fallen ill and who needed that sort of life-sustaining nutritional supplement that it gave. As well as chocolate became associated more as a beverage for children, which is interesting because previous to this time, chocolate was really thought to be too stimulating for children. But by the 19th century, the later 19th century, chocolate really experienced a resurgence in popularity. You had the introduction of lighter and easier to mix chocolate powders. And therefore, you also had an increase in fashionable ceramics to produce drinking chocolate in a very fashionable, elegant way probably for ladies who desired to drink chocolate maybe later in the afternoon. Probably not as a breakfast beverage, but maybe more for entertaining their friends. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, imported and domestic made chocolate pots were sort of redesigned, as you can see here. They don't really look like the chocolate pots we saw previously. There was no need for that stirring rod or the chocolate mill because these reformulated cocoa powders had the cocoa butter squeezed out of them. So it really reduced that cocoa butter content from the high of about 52, 53% down to maybe about 28%. So it was a defatted cocoa, which made it easier to mix with milk or with water or whatever kind of beverage you had. And it didn't have a tendency to separate out as much. And though the price of chocolate plummeted, making it more affordable to a mass audience, drinking chocolate still remained a fashionable and elite social custom well into the 20th century. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat or however Sarah would like to handle it.
Thank you so much. Yes,
Sure.
if anyone has anything to say, down at the bottom in the Q&A would be perfect. I will get the ball rolling. Have you found many instances of people cooking with chocolate in this time period? Or
You do.
is it exclusively a drink?
So the majority of people are, once they get the chocolate balls or lumps, they are making beverage chocolate. But if you look in recipe books and manuals for this, late 17th, early 18th century, as well as manuscript recipes, you do find chocolate pies, chocolate tarts. So you do find that chocolate is being incorporated into what we might call desserts. But it is not the overwhelming use for it. So you might have a pie, a tart that might have chocolate in it, but it's really not the preferred use of chocolate. It's not where you would find it normally. But yes, chocolate creams, so things that you would kind of mix chocolate with in order to produce a frothy dessert or a pie that you would bake or a tart. So you will find them in a lot of usually English cookbooks from the 18th century will have some recipes for chocolate.
Amanda, I don't think we've ever chatted about what got you first interested in learning about and studying the history of chocolate.
I was really interested in chocolate. It was sort of one of those things where I was just interested in hot beverages. I am a ceramics person, so of all the decorative arts, ceramics is my favorite sort of slice of the pie. I also curate the metals collection here at Historic Deerfield as well, but ceramics and glass are sort of kind of where I started out in my career when I started out at the Winterthur Museum, and I've always been interested in those three hot beverages and how they kind of really revolutionized the world when they sort of entered into the diet of Europeans in about, usually if you're talking about England, they all arrive around 1650, and it is a tremendous revolution. So it's not only a revolution in diet, but those three beverages also create a revolution in the ceramics industry, is that they respond and start to produce new forms, and new things, as well as the middle class get interested in. It's not only for the elite, but everyone kind of gets interested in serving of these hot beverages. And so it really stimulates the ceramics market, as well as the silver market as well. And you get a rush of new forms, but also you get a rush of ceramic bodies that are, not the high end. So Chinese export porcelain is usually taking care of the high end, but you get a lot for the middle class. And places like Staffordshire, England, really start to, which had made more ordinary things like butter pots and, dishes and other types of more ordinary ceramics. They start to make these refined, thin bodies to supply the middle class market with some very nice refined teawares that are not as expensive as Chinese porcelain. So it really is the start of a lot of very interesting things. And of course, also the start of a real strong need for sugar. So it has, positive effects on sort of industries, and then it also has, terrible effects, because it definitely is spurring the West Indies to become monocultures, meaning they are almost exclusively focused on the production of sugar to excluding everything else. And sugar is so labor intensive that they have the mills running all the time. Is once you harvest it, you might have two days at most before the sugar cane goes bad. So you just are constantly working to create sugar, and that has terrible effects upon the need for labor. And and first they try to get labor from maybe Native Americans who don't are the sort of they don't win in King Philip's War, and so they transport Native American workers to the islands. They transport people who so-called lost the bloodless revolution in 1688, so they're transporting Irish people and other people to Barbados. But eventually the solution for them is to transport West Africans to be the main labor source for the sugar plantations. So it's one of those things. It's sort of these are three beverages that really change the world in good ways and bad.
Very true. We do have a question in the chat. Thanks, Donna. She's curious if the countries that produce chocolate have changed over time. Are we still getting chocolate from the same places that it came from in the past, or are there different top producers today?
That's a great question. So very early on in chocolate's history, chocolate was taken to other places in that belt of 20 degrees north and south of the equator. And one of the first places it was taken was to an island off the coast of Africa called Sao Tome, which is a Portuguese colony, and then eventually quickly introduced into West Africa. So today, I think it's 65 to maybe 70% of the world's chocolate is produced in West Africa, in the area of Ghana, of Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast. Those are the main chocolate producing areas today. You also have some chocolate production in Indonesia, and still you have chocolate production in Ecuador, Venezuela, some in the Dominican Republic. St. Lucia is also smaller, but a chocolate producer. You can go down and see chocolate plantations down there. So just think of that belt of 20 degrees north and south, and chocolate has been produced almost everywhere. But today, the majority of the chocolate is produced in West Africa, which also comes with attendant problems too of free and unfree labor sources. So I think you may want to look into your chocolate to see. I think there's a big, huge boom in artisan chocolate, and very often they point to the source of where the chocolate comes from. So the majority of chocolate being produced in West Africa is a type of chocolate known as Forastero, which is a very hardy, good producing chocolate tree. It's not it's resistant to blight and other problems. But it also produces, I wouldn't say a mediocre chocolate, but it produces an average chocolate. It is no highs, no lows. You know, it's just produces a good average chocolate, which is probably what most of us are used to is Forastero. But in places, especially in Ecuador and Venezuela and other places, they're trying to specialize in some of the more rare varieties. And one of the rare varieties is called Criollo. That's Crilio, Criollo. And it's probably one of the hardest to, it's doesn't produce a lot. It's like a, little hothouse flower. It's susceptible to disease, but it produces some of the finest types of chocolate. And so you're getting a lot of people who are specializing in kind of breeding and planting some of these earlier or more rare varieties and trying to create a blend with some of these.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any other questions from our audience. This is your last call.
Your last chance. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Amanda, thank you so much. And I think we will be calling on you again in short order, because I loved your answer about those three beverages all intersecting and changing the world, because next year is the 250th anniversary of the tea burning here in Lexington. And we are looking to do a much larger scale exhibition on coffee, tea, and chocolate. So I will have you on speed dial for that one.
It's as the revolution, the anniversary of the revolution comes closer, we'll be talking a lot more about tea. And it is a fascinating topic. Thank you so much.
As Carol mentioned as well, if anyone is interested in learning even more and you were not able to get to Carol's talk last weekend, our new Archives and Research Center at Monroe Tavern is open from 12 to 3 on Saturdays, so that you can see a private collection of chocolate-related memorabilia and various tools.
Awesome. Thank you again, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for everyone who attended the lecture today.